Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast welcomes Eric Carroll, a filmmaker, author, and Justice for Dads founder of Dad Talk Today. Family Courts Exposed is our topic. Eric Carroll, thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Hey, thank you so much.
Tell us about your book, Justice for Dads, The Forgotten Parent in Family Court.
My book has been about 5 years in the making. 5 years ago, I started Dad Talk Today to raise awareness towards what men were going through in the family court system, and not just with the family court system, but society in general. I think there's a lot of negative stereotypes towards men. Just wanted to bring those out and make people aware of what's going on. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. It is a very big rabbit hole that you go down, and there's so many different problems that are attached to it. And what I find is, as you're telling people about what's going on, sometimes it could be a little bit of information overload, because 1 second I knew nothing about this, and now, wow, there's just so much. So through that book, I try to tell, different stories of people that I've met over the years, real life instances where this happened, where it can give the reader an idea of just how bad this is. And hopefully by the end of that book, you can understand just how this issue affects just about everything we are going through in society.
There's probably a lot of things you could spend your time on. What prompted you to follow up on this one?
Well, that was one of them. I noticed, I could spend, a good bit of time with somebody, and I was barely scratching the surface on this. I was like, I'd love to be able to sit down and really just dive deep into this so I could give people a little bit more information, and they can go at their own pace. Because a lot of times when people get that information overload, they'll just check out, not because they want to. It's just like, I physically can't, or I mentally can't take this. There is a lot that's going on with this. So that was really the crux of why I did that.
Let's talk about the family courts. If you hear the name and you've never been in the system, it sounds like a nice, friendly place. What's the reality of the family courts?
So the family courts is a place that most people would think, I'm going to go here to get custody of my children because me and my ex don't get along anymore. It sounds like it's there to decrease conflict. When you end up going through a divorce with your ex, or maybe you weren't married, but you had kids or whatever, you're probably going through some of the worst conflict in your life. Sometimes people can do it amicably. More times than not, it's not. And so by that time, we still have the house, the kids, the dog, everything that we got to decide on what's going to be done with it. And so it's a very stressful time. And when we go in the courts, they should be there to de-escalate that conflict. But we see that is not what's happening. I know when I went to an attorney to try to find out what it was going to be for me to fight as a father who had no rights to my daughter, what is it going to take me in order to fight for custody? And I didn't have this huge case or anything. It was a normal case. But the attorney told me they wanted $10,000 on retainer just to get started. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, maybe this was just a ridiculous attorney right here. Let me go talk to another one. And then I just kept getting that everywhere I was going. And that, again, was just to get started. What I started seeing is once it goes to the court, I've never heard anybody say the family court helped my situation and helped us get along. Wow. Once you get in there, it's a winner-take-all scenario where the winner is going to get the kids, he's going to get, the majority of everything, and the loser is going to have to pay for it all, and they're going to lose everything. And what they do is they teach these parents who need to learn how to co-parent how to fight. They go in there and encourage them to bring up trash all the way back to middle and high school against each other. And it's about assassinating that person's character so that you can make yourself look good. And because, hey, I've got something, I've got to win here. I don't want to pay the child support. I don't want to lose the house. I don't want to lose the dog. I want the kid most of the time. And so that's what we're seeing. There's no real equality there. There's always got to be a winner, and they pay dearly for it. It's one of the most corrupt industries that I've seen on the face of this earth.
Let's talk about the judges who are in the family court. Is it the system that's biased, or is it the judges that are not treating people fairly?
It's all of it. Every once in a while, you'll see a judge that really stands on merit, does what is supposed to be done, but everybody in the family court system profits off of this. And like I said, it's a very, very deep rabbit hole. But from what we are seeing so far, I mean, and a lot of these judges nowadays, I mean, look at the political divide we have in this country. Yeah. That's another thing. It could be that the judge has different politics than you, or has a feminist bias. We see that a lot. Not only that, one of the biggest issues in family court is the fact that judges are running campaigns to get elected. And so what we are seeing, I have done my investigative work and went to these family court judges' campaigns when they're trying to get in office, and they'll be sitting there raising funds. Well, guess who's giving them the money? It's the family court attorneys. You know that person is the one that gave you the money to run your campaign and got you that position. Are you going to have a bias towards them in court? Very common that people will do research when they find out who their judge is going to be to make sure they are getting the attorney that puts the maximum amount of contributions in that campaign, because there's going to be a bias there. And that's a very well-known thing in the family courts, and unfortunately is very true.
Eric, one of the areas that you are concerned with, and rightfully so, is the issue of domestic violence and abuse and how that relates to child custody. So first of all, how common is that component, domestic violence and abuse, in the family courts?
Very common. It comes up more often than not. The problem with domestic violence is we're finding about 20% of the claims when it comes to domestic violence are founded, and you got about 80% that are false allegations.
And are those used weaponized? In other words, we're going to put you on the defensive by making something up about you and then make you defend that you're not doing it?
100%. And it has became a nightmare. I didn't know just how bad that was until I started doing this. I mean, again, I was just a normal dad that started going through the system. And when I saw a little bit of it, I started it, but I had no background in it, no education. And once I started getting in there and getting the stories from the dads, that's when it really started to wake me up on like how bad this really is. Accusations of domestic violence are running rampant, because right now, if somebody accuses you of physical abuse, and not just physical abuse, the one that was very hard for me was the amount of sexual abuse allegations that are going through, because that even has like an even worse taste in your mouth, especially when you're hearing these allegations towards kids. And even when I first started the show and I would have somebody come and tell me they were being accused of something like that, I was doing everything in my power to get out of the conversation so I didn't have to talk to them. And that is what is so scary about it. It instantly gives the person that's making that accusation the upper hand in family court. They do not have to prove it. Sometimes it can be almost impossible to prove your innocence. And even if you do prove your innocence towards any of these allegations, there is no consequence for the person that made the accusation. I mean, it is absolutely horrendous what's going on.
Yeah, that's extremely troubling, because that seems to be the most powerful weapon. If you make up a sexual abuse claim, that sounds almost like you'd have an instant winner on the person who's making the claim against the other person. Is that how it normally turns out?
The nickname for it in a family court is called the silver bullet. Now, we've actually gotten videos of attorneys telling other attorneys to do this. If you are losing in family court, they don't call it the silver bullet, but you got to start making these allegations. It's easy It's expected in family court, and from that moment on, your client will be on the winning side of this thing. And look, when somebody's accused of that, just because of like how the bad nature of that type of accusation, nobody wants to believe that person anymore. It ruins their reputation. Even if you can prove your innocence, you will have this black cloud that follows you around for the rest of your life because you've been accused of one of the worst things that a human being can possibly do. And even me, I became ashamed later on. I turned a cold shoulder numerous times to people who I would later find out were falsely accused. And it was just because that accusation was just so, man. And the bad part about this is there are kids that this is happening to. So you got the boy who cried wolf in there, and then you got the ones that these are really happening to, and it's hard to distinguish. And then once you get inside the family court jungle where the money and the bias is taking control, they base the whole family court system off of the best interest of the child, is what they say. Nobody can tell you what the best interest of the child is. The best interest of the child would be to de-escalate the conflict between these parents, protect that relationship for the kids with their parents so that they can make sure they have mom and dad, and to use as little money as possible to do that, because that was money that was made off a sacrifice of time from that parent so that he can support that child or send them to college or put food in their mouth. You're taking that away from them and putting it in somebody else's pocket just so he can get time with his children. That should be a God-given right in the first place. I mean, it is truly a circus.
To what extent and how are children's wishes viewed by the court?
You know, most of the time up until about 14, very little. Once they hit 14, what we are seeing is a lot of times the child can tell who they want to live with. You know, that sounds good to an extent. I've seen it in cases where there was a kid that needed to make it to that age because they was in a situation that they couldn't get out of until it happened. But nowadays, I hate to say this, but I'm seeing this more and more. It has become very common that these parents are becoming best friends. And a child wants what a child wants. A lot of times they're going to go to the parent that's the friend that lets them stay on the cell phone all night, that lets them go off with their boyfriend or girlfriend all the time, lets them do what they want to do. It's just another problem. They don't base it off of that. I have seen it numerous times. Let's go before 14, where a child is telling them, hey, my mom is not taking care of me. She's on drugs. She's doing all these horrendous things. And because it's a child wanting to go with their father, nothing works. I've got several stories where kids end up dying that were warning the system, you need to let me go with my dad. And they just would not do it. Like I said, the other problem is once they become a teenager, we all had a wild stage. A lot of times they're wanting to go with the friend because that's who's going to let them do what they want to do. Man, it's really messed up.
I've heard for many years that the courts had a bias against fathers in general and a bias toward mothers. Is that still the case, and is there any change in that culturally? More
people are waking up to it because it's been known forever. I mean, everybody's always pretty much, heard the stereotype that if you're a father in court, it's going to go to the mom. More people are starting to talk about it. More dads are getting their stories out there, so there's been a little bit more pushback, but I wouldn't say too much change as far as the system. Look, I mean, when a child is born, the mom has all the rights. The father has none until he goes and fights, even if he was married. There are some states that are starting to do the right things. The state of Florida last year probably got some of the most promising legislation out there. They started what's called the Good Dad Act, which as long as you prove that that's your child through a paternity test, you will have equal rights to your child upon that without a court fight. Most amazing thing that I've ever heard of. And they also passed what's called equal shared parenting, which says when you go into the courtroom, the father has equal standing to the mom, which is the way it should be. If you could see just how bad these states fight back at legislation like that, it's appalling. And then they also got rid of alimony, which is a whole other issue. In many of these states, you get divorced to a woman as long as she never remarries, she can get a sizable alimony and get it for the rest of her life. They did away with that. So Florida's really made a lot of headway. I say if they could get in there and make sure there's consequences for false allegations, that would be the perfect state to live in. But we still have 49 other states that are way behind the ball on this thing. It goes by very slowly. Part of your problem is a lot of your legislators are attorneys, and you got attorneys that are making the law for which they then go in there and they're fighting, for. That's how they make their money. Anytime there's, money or incentives in there, there's going to be corruption. That's kind of the catch-22 we're having with the family court issues.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment with our guest, Eric Carroll.
SchillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
SchillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
SchillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
SchillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit SchillingShowMedia.com. That's SchillingShowMedia.com.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
The new book is Injustice for Dads, The Forgotten Parent in Family Court. Eric Carroll is our guest. Let's talk about child support and how that's used, how it works, and moms versus dads. Is there any difference in child support?
There are cases where moms are going to go through it just like a dad, and I'll give you the reason why. It's way, way less than it usually is with dads. And so this is a long topic. I'm going to try to condense it down for you as much as I can. Years ago, when Ronald Reagan was the governor of California, way before president, he started no-fault divorce in California. And when he did that, pretty much every state followed in his footsteps. He later said when he did that it was the worst thing he ever did when he was in office. He realized the problem that it caused. Up until that point in time, I'm sure we've all heard, in our grandparents' age, they fought, they stayed together, they didn't just get divorced. At that point, so many marriages started getting divorces that didn't before, and divorce just skyrocketed. And with that happening, so many single mothers were going on welfare, food stamps, having to get insurance. It was becoming a very big drain to the state. They went to the federal government and said, hey, we're going to have to do something about this. So originally, it was meant to be a good thing. They started something called Title 4D of the Social Security Act, which says 2/3 of every dollar paid in child support will be reimbursed to the states through the federal government. And that was going to help offset all of these costs. Along the way, again, where I said earlier, was there's money, there's going to be corruption. They found out to maximize that incentive, whoever makes the most money in a family, if they get the least amount of time, they have to pay the max in child support. Predominantly, that's going to be the dad, the breadwinner. And so we started seeing these dads get very little time, very little custody. And that's really where this thing has gotten. And now these cases where you see moms are on the losing end, a lot of times it's with celebrities that make a lot of money. It is in their best interest that mom gets the least amount of time as possible because she's going to pay the max in child support. Now, we got people that are paying, $80,000 and $100,000 on up a month in child support. What do they have? That's not child support. That's a whole lifestyle right there. Yeah. And it's just, there's no rules, there's no maximum, no anything to when it comes to child support. That's because the system has really set it up to maximize those funds. But that's really where the crux of the matter with child support started.
One of the great concerns of parents I've talked to before in all of this is Child Protective Services, which again is supposed to be helpful but has been misused and weaponized. What have you heard about Child Protective Services?
So CPS is its own little monster, and people talk about the child trafficking that's going on across the border, which is a horrendous situation. With CPS, what we are seeing, there's many cases where kids that need to be taken by CPS are not being taken, and then the ones that don't need to be are being taken. And for every child that the system through CPS gets and adopts back out, there is an incentive. They make money off of every child that they bring in and send back out. And I believe there is like lifetime incentives as long as that person keeps that child. Incentives keep going into CPS. We see that CPS is severely understaffed. They have very little people in many of these offices. It is very scary to know how many kids are being taken by the system. And some of the things that they take these kids for is ridiculous. I mean, if you go back to 2020 and COVID, if you didn't give your child the vaccine, there was all these little things. You know, I don't know if we can talk about that on here, but
yeah, we can.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, we can.
Okay. You know, it's a hot button issue. And that's another sad part to this, because it's the thing that needs to be talked about. But because it goes against the narrative, parents weren't allowed to speak up against it. But CPS definitely needs to be it needs to be torn down and rebuilt, because I believe CPS is needed. There are kids that are going through some nightmare situations that need to be saved, and that's what CPS was supposed to be for. But more times than not, we're seeing CPS get involved in cases they should never have to look at.
The reports that I have from people I've talked to is that CPS has a decided political bent, a social bent. And so if you go in and you're a Christian or you have certain ideas about sexuality and gender, they could be working against you just because the agent of CPS disagrees with your position. I'm assuming you've seen that.
Oh, very true. Very true. So one of the major cases that I'm working on right now, and this is becoming more and more of an issue. You know, 10 years ago, it was unheard of. Now, I'm having more parents reach out to me every day, is the child gender transition surgeries.
Yeah.
One of my best friends, his name is Jeff Younger. He's actually in court in LA today. He's been fighting this for several years since his son was 7 years old. His ex-wife has been trying to change his son into a girl, and she doesn't want to just do that socially. She wants to medically transition this boy and chemically castrate him. His name is James. She calls him Luna. Yeah. And this happened in the state of Texas. And she was a pediatrician. Surprisingly, in the state of Texas, that you would think, you know, red conservative state that would not allow this to happen, they were allowing it to happen every step of the way. They begged the governor to step in and do something about it. He wouldn't do anything about it. You know, luckily last year, there was some people that worked on it. I went to the Capitol, made sure I reported on it. We got the law passed in the state of Texas that these gender transition surgeries cannot happen on kids. But what did the state of Texas do? Because it was a liberal judge and they disagreed with him politically, they allowed her to move to California. They gave her that. Now he's fighting against this in LA County. To where they've got laws that are going through in California that if you do not affirm your child that is confused about this and thinks they have transgender issues, that you lose your kid. That's one of the things that's going on with CPS. If you don't say, yes, you're telling the truth, you're allowed to change your gender, or I don't get along with it, you can lose your kid that easy. And that is one of the most scary things I've ever heard of.
Where do people find hope in all of this? Because it sounds very dire, and I can imagine that people just get worn down by the process. So where do they look to hope?
It's very true. I mean, I'm not going to lie. That's been one of the problems. I've had to take my breaks recently because these stories get to you. Unfortunately, it's the truth, and it's what's going on, and it can be very gloom and doom. And so a lot of people, when they hear about it, they just don't want to touch it. The hope and motivation should be that you might not be going through it personally, but it affects everything that's going on in this country. If we do not have strong families, we will never have a strong country. And even though you might not be going through it personally, what about your kids and your grandkids? And by the time they're going through it, it's too late. We've got to start getting proactive instead of reactive. The hope would be that there are states like Florida that's doing this. And, you know, years ago, we didn't have social media. we didn't have this machine where we can really raise our voices and change it and fight back at the narrative. And what I'm seeing online now, a lot of these things that they're trying to push in society, people are pushing back. And we have the ability to do that. Family is special. Being a dad is one of the greatest things that I've ever done on the face of this earth. And when that right was denied to me, I started raising my voice. And look, I was just a regular dad going through this. 5.5 years later, I have close to 1.5 million followers online that have that are resonating with these issues, that are fighting back, which tells me you don't have to be anything special or go to school to learn about this. You just got to speak up and stand for what you believe in. There is a way to fight back at this, guys. And there are like-minded people that will, lock arms with you and help you along the way. You just got to take a step and have some faith and do the right thing. But I would say to anybody that is going through this or working on this, you got to take breaks, because this is not the whole world. It's easy to sit there and dwell on it and like it's get gloom and doom, but you got to take breaks and make sure that you've got balance in your life, because it definitely can run you down.
Eric Carroll, if people would like to get a copy of your book, Injustice for Dads, or if they want to follow your podcast, your other work online, how can they do that? I'm
on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. That book, it will definitely walk you through at your own pace where you can learn about it. I have a documentary that we just released that I pray everybody will go and watch. I released it on Substack so I can make sure I'm not facing any censorship, because anything that's pro-dad, a lot of times they get censorship, and social media loves to throw these restrictions on me. So that's dadtalktoday.substack.com. To date, this is the biggest project I've ever worked on. There was close to $100,000 that went into making this 45-minute documentary that has actors and everything in it. But it was one of the first cases that I reported on Dad Talk. And it was really when I found out just how serious this gets. It was about a little girl that the dad was fighting for custody. He was 21 years old. And because he didn't have the money, he couldn't get custody of his daughter. And her mom was a drug addict. And she was doing crystal meth. They were doing something I'd never heard of, where they soak crystal meth in a bottle of water. And so it stretches it out further and they can put it in a water bomb. And one night she was partying with her cousins and the little girl was asleep. She woke up in the middle of the night. She was thirsty. So she gets her mom's bottle of water that's beside the bed and drinks it. Well, that was her mom's crystal meth. It set her into cardiac arrest. And when they noticed what was going on, they didn't take her to the hospital right away. They started trying to exorcise the demons out of her, soaking her in a bath of milk. She was dead hours before they took her to the hospital. And the father was the last one to hear about it. What hurts my heart so bad, guys, is this was a death that could have been prevented if a father had rights. And there's more cases like this. This is one of the worst case scenarios. But I made this one to make sure that her story gets out there. She was such a bright, beautiful, young little girl whose life was lost. It's a direct consequence from the family courts not protecting a father with his rights that we're even talking about this story. So it's called Lost Innocence, the story of Sophia Larson. If you could, please get out there and support it, because I'm doing everything I can to get the word out, and it's really hard. The mainstream media rarely talks about it, if at all.
Eric Carroll, you're doing the heavy lifting for a lot of people. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Hey, I appreciate it so much.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time,